Live on the Unboxed Podcast. I am live with my man Richard Franklin. How you feeling, man?
Cool, good to see you. Feel great, thank you.
You doing good? Doing good.
Love the weather. This is why I came to California.
I know, man. Los Angeles is the spot to be. Yeah. Well, let's dive right in. Okay. So we're gonna talk about your story. We're gonna talk about a whole bunch of stuff today. Okay. Let you know we've discussed before coming on here. It's a little conversation. At the end of the day, I have no direction with this. It's just I just want people to come on here and I want people to understand like the real you, and we'll talk about some controversial topics. They don't have to always be controversial, but we'll just talk about topics and then,
Sure.
All right. So starting off, let's let the people know a little bit about you. What's your story? Where'd you come from, and who are you?
Well, I came originally from London. I was born in London. I was actually born in the house of interestingly enough, of Sir Alexander Fleming, who discovered penicillin, which is essentially antibiotics.
Oh, okay.
And I've had a strange brush with sort of famous people in medicine because it so happens that my aunt, my father's sister, is credited as one of the discoverers of DNA. And so our entire world is currently based on just those two. But in my aunt's particular case, she was also equally famous for her work in viruses, where she was the first person to discover the three-dimensional structure of a virus, which means that all the work being done in the world to fight viruses, the foundational work for that work comes from her also.
Yeah, so she basically saved us.
A very interesting, I came from a very old, distinguished Jewish family that had tremendous amounts of achievers in it. For example, and they're all relevant today in a strange way, because if you look at what's going on in the Middle East, my great uncle, who I knew, was the governor of Palestine. He was the ruler on behalf of the British. He was what they called the High Commissioner. And so I have a long association with, political people and scientific people. My father was a banker. I came from a long line of bankers. So I had a sort of unusual eclectic background just from the very start. And then, of course, growing up in London, which was this unbelievably culturally rich city, was a big deal for me. I fell in love with classical music and art and literature. And that's how I grew up. And then my father emigrated to America because he saw business opportunities in 1980, and the whole family came with him. And I was very active on Wall Street in the 80s with my father.
Okay, when you guys first came here, did you guys come straight to Los Angeles, or what was your first stop?
My father moved to New York.
Okay, New York.
And I actually moved to Miami for a while. And then one of my father's partners died. And he asked me if I wanted to come and join the company. And they were huge in what was then...
This was investment banking,
the great
correct?
movement in America, which is in the 80s, which was called the corporate takeover movement, in which people were hugely involved in taking over in great battles big American companies, and that's what we were engaged in doing in a big way. And so I had this, spectacularly interesting background in Wall Street in the 80s, and then I felt that, I'd grown up and seen business, I'd knew everybody, I'd seen everything, and I thought, what's next in life? And I came to California really to... if you ask me really why did I come, I think the real reason I came was I fell in love with a beautiful black actress who ended up starring in a what's considered something of an iconic movie in the black community, which was Passenger 57 with Wesley Snipes. And so I came with her to the States, bought a house.
What was her name?
To California, Alex Datcher.
Alex Dasher.
And then I moved to California really because we were dating in LA, and she was a flight attendant when I knew her. And the movie actually is about a hijack where she plays a flight attendant, but she really was a flight attendant. And I met her on the airplane, and I chased her around the airplane for about 7 hours. And eventually ended up dating her. And then I moved here, bought a house in the Hollywood Hills, which I still have to this day, 34 years later.
Yeah, so you're actually the current owner of the most levels in Los Angeles.
The most levels in California.
In California, actually, yeah.
And the reason for that is to sort of jump forward a long way, which was that I got into photography. And the better I became as a photographer, the more I realized I needed a studio. But I just wasn't prepared to get up in the morning and go to one. I wasn't prepared to, for a start, go downtown, which I found frightening and ugly. And the idea of being on the freeway, I just wasn't going to do it. and taking some warehouse in Van Nuys or something. I just said, no, I just don't want to do it.
Yeah. So let me just build it here.
So I decided to try and see if I could get planning permission to build my house. My house started off with 2 levels and a loft, and it's now 8 levels.
8
And I
levels.
managed to get planning permission that simply to this day, literally nobody can believe.
Do you know what's on each level?
You bet. I mean, I live it every day.
Well,
But
eight
when you
levels,
look
you
at
know.
my studio, I get a lot of press because people misunderstand my house. It's currently described in all the articles. I had about 30 in the last couple of years as LA's Kardashian House of Sin, California's most eclectic home, and which is really ridiculous because I happened to shoot Kim Kardashian early in her career, so I get stuck with that all the time. And then the fact that my house looks colorful is only because my style as a photographer is very colorful.
Yeah.
So everybody thinks, oh my God, this must be a Playboy mansion, sleazy, awful party animal guy, And in fact, that's not true at all. I live basically alone with my dog, and I don't date. And I have my makeup artist, who I've known for years, lives in my house also. And I keep very quiet. I don't really enjoy socializing. I don't go to clubs. I don't have parties at the house. And but it looks like a sort of mini Playboy mansion. And
Yeah.
that's only because if you're going to be good at photography, at least in the first area that I became known in, I guess, which was glamour photography, and I've shot 500 or 600 models, I had a style, and you have to stand for something. So what did I stand for? I stood for, first of all, ethnic diversity. I primarily shot black women over white women. That was something. So I became a little bit unusual in that respect. I had tremendously colorful backgrounds, and my shoots always have a lot of fun in them, a lot of fun colors. I think in my entire career of 25 years and having shot well over 1 million pictures, I've never once shot a black and white picture.
Never once.
And I don't think it was until about my 15th or 16th year into photography that I actually ever shot a picture in natural light. Because I was really a studio photographer, so I was always surrounded by masses of lights.
I remember they were telling me that you actually don't Photoshop any of your pictures, and the realism inside of your pictures is extraordinary.
Well, it's true up to a point, in the sense that I from my glamour photography, I then went in simultaneously into what I call figurative art, which means primarily shooting women, but in very, very complex ways, but also very high concepts like geishas and harlequins and Greek mythology and all sorts of elevated things. And all of my pictures, if you look at that, look extremely complicated. But I've never created an effect in my entire life. No, not once. I refused. I felt that creating an effect in Photoshop, to me, was very much to do with my old English value system, which I still cling to, and I felt it was cheating. So what I do, but I use Photoshop in my glamour photography to clean up skin tones.
Yeah.
If you're shooting somebody and they've got bruises, or they got pimples, or they don't have a good makeup job, I don't mind a touch-up like that. But I do specialize in lots of special effects, and none of those have ever come through anything other than directly from the camera, so they're ever in Photoshop. So I think that I get a kick out of the fact that people look at my work and they simply find that hard to believe. And I get some satisfaction from that, because it means that I've aimed very high to try and have a high standard of doing something that's complex. The other area where I've become known is I'm the only photographer, so it's easy to say you're the dominant one. I happen to be the only one in the world shooting what I call abstract images of outer space. Now, outer space is, I literally have done pictures before NASA, and I'm not actually interested in outer space, but I find that I'm interested in patterns. So I shoot patterns in complex ways, and then discover afterwards that a pattern that I've done corresponds to something that maybe is a pattern I've done, let's say 10 years ago, that I suddenly discover that NASA's made a new discovery and it happens to look identical. I've done that a few times, and that surprises me, But the truth is that if we accept that space is utterly infinite, and that anything we must expect the unexpected all the time, and we're always discovering new things that look in different ways, then if you are shooting patterns, it's not entirely surprising that sometimes something will look like something else. So, for example, you hear from people all the time who suddenly see what they think is a figure of a man, maybe on the moon or on Mars or something like this, or a statue or something. And that's what any scientist will say is our association with what we call being a pattern-seeking animal. We see patterns, we associate them with another pattern, and then we think that must be a man on Mars, where it's not. It's just it's just a shape of something that corresponds to something else. So
As humans, we look for those patterns.
we look for those things that they're part of our evolutionary makeup of protecting ourselves. But the fact is that it's very real that in my cosmic work, it's been something of a surprise and a pleasure to me that I literally have done things that are either identical to things that NASA does or sometimes before them. And but I never actually look at any images of outer space at all. I have no real interest in outer space. I found that I became a little more curious when I was doing it, because people would say things, oh, it's like the Hubble or it's like the James Webb, which are the great telescopes up there. But I tease people. I say, we spent $10 billion on the James Webb. If you'd given me $1 billion, I would have given you, pretty much the same.
Out of all,
You have to understand my English sense of humor. It's just a bit flip about it, but it's the interesting thing about outer space when photography is that I think that what images that people see on Earth, I don't think people realize that they're not quite what the camera shot. So, for example, if you see glorious images from the Hubble, they've got a famous image called Pillars of Creation. And lots of people have seen this around the world, and you see this glorious color and this majesty of the universe. Well, you have to remember, the Hubble is actually a black and white camera. So whatever you've seen in color isn't what is shot. So what really you're seeing all the time in space is you're seeing, by the way, the James Webb, which is the newest camera, is an infrared camera. And so any color pictures you see from it are not also what it's shot in that way. So a lot of what you see is highly sophisticated algorithms in the computer, what they call stacking of an enormous amounts of images, which are then processed together, and then they use various filters to approximate what the wavelengths of colors were in that area, and then in a sense photoshopped after that. So whereas I start from another direction, where I say, I start off with no Photoshop whatsoever to create an image that looks prettier than what they do.
Exactly.
That's not. I think that outer space is magnificent, infinite, and I have the utmost respect for the scientists who can create a camera that can take these unbelievable pictures that go billions of light years back in time. But if you say to me, is it beautiful? No, I don't think it's necessarily beautiful. There's a lot of images that scientists would find extremely important and fascinating, but they're not beautiful.
do you think you've ever
Whereas I
seen?
try to create my images to be beautiful deliberately, so that there are things that you would want to have on your walls.
Do you think you've ever seen space, like life outside of space,
Meaning what? Do I believe in
like aliens or anything?
I'm one of those people who goes by science and by evidence. The interesting thing about the speculations about life on other planets is that you will find probably a very large amount of scientists, probably the majority, who would say that it's likely that there's vast amounts of alien life forms on other planets. But you must remember there's also very, very interesting, serious, highly knowledgeable scientists who can make the case that it's also possible that we're literally alone in the universe. That's very hard for people to believe, but you have to remember that when we're dealing with science, a great deal of science is what they call counterintuitive. So, for example, what I think made people find Darwin very difficult to understand is people couldn't understand how is it possible that something unbelievably complex like a human or any animal can actually evolve from nothing, a single cell. Because throughout history, people said, no, complex things must have a designer, therefore there must be a God, therefore there must be intelligent design, and that's how people got here. Now, this is not true, in my opinion. I believe that we got here because of Darwinian method of evolution, which is now taught and accepted and is the basis of much of our science and medicine. And in fact, that we got here because of the processes of evolution over time. That is now, I think, provable in every single case. I don't think they've ever found a case where they can't, where they're defeated by this. there are gaps in evolutionary knowledge, but the fact is we didn't get here because, for example, women didn't get here because Adam was bored in the Garden of Eden, and while he was asleep, God took a rib out of him and made a woman. I find that profoundly insulting to women. We got here by a much greater method, which is over time, the constant sifting of one generation of mutation to another, so that everything is constantly improving and getting more and more and more sophisticated. And that's what essentially evolution does, is in every generation, that which is most suited to its environment will pass on the genes to the next generation. And in doing that, you just get better and better and better all the time.
Mm-hmm.
And so I'm a guy who, on questions like aliens and things, I find them not very interesting because, the speculation like that, do I believe we're being visited by anybody? Absolutely not. I think that one of the things about the human animal, as an atheist as I am, is that one of the things about the human animal is we seem to think we're terribly important, and that, God, throughout history, we thought we were the center of the universe. We now know that we are not even a speck of dust in the universe.
Yeah, that makes sense.
There are we now know in the observable universe that there are 2 trillion, I repeat, trillion galaxies. Each galaxy, we reckon, has about 400 billion stars, and we reckon we only have seen 3% of the universe. Now, if you play with those numbers, you realize it's impossible to get your head around. But the idea that we had throughout history was that we're the center of the universe. We're the center of God's plan. We're created in his image, and he actually cares about us and involved in our lives. I'll be honest with you, there's not a shred of evidence or belief that I have in any of that proposition. So I'm a total atheist.
So what do you believe when we die? If you die right now, where do you go?
I believe when we die that, if you listen to Neil deGrasse Tyson, who I think puts it very poetically, and he's one of the finest and most respected explainers of science, and people ask him this question, he's happy to talk about it. He says that when I die, the flora and fauna will dine on me as I have dined on them throughout my entire life. And so I believe we go absolutely nowhere. I think that there is no meaning to life whatsoever. The universe doesn't know that we're here. But, so what I think that we do to get through life is we give meaning to our lives. I have a deeply meaningful life, as you do, in a meaningless world. The world has no meaning. Life has no meaning.
Okay,
We give our lives meaning by all sorts of things. Like, for example, just now talking about subjects that interest us, and you being interested and me being interested to talk, those in a sense give us meaning. We become curious about things. If we didn't give our lives meaning and we only dwelled on the fact that we're going to die and there's no meaning whatsoever, I think that would be very hard for people to get up in the morning. So we trick ourselves throughout our lives. We give ourselves titles, we make friends, we want to get noticed. I would suggest to you that one of the reasons I think we're all so hooked on Instagram and Facebook, or why they're so successful, is that they play into our psyche, which is we want to have people say like. We want people to notice us. We want to feel important. We want to feel that we've lived. The worst fear that people have is they're going to live and die without being noticed.
So you actually shot Kim Kardashian before she was Kim Kardashian.
Well, she was Kim Kardashian, but she wasn't particularly famous. She was less famous than she is now.
Yeah. So how was
she
that?
was still a big deal at the time. I didn't enjoy it at all. I thought she was delightful.
You didn't enjoy shooting Kim Kardashian?
Not at all. But that was nothing to do with her. I want to be very clear about that. We had a nice chat together when I met her. She was a sweet girl. What I hated about it was that I came to realize what I'm not as a photographer. You have to recognize that you can be good at photography, but that doesn't mean you're good at everything. Mm-hmm. And for example, I'm sensible enough to know what I'm not good at. I'm not a guy who's good at being given direction. I'm probably more of an artist who just wants to do my own thing.
Okay.
But therefore, I shouldn't be hired by people because they want to do their thing.
Okay.
So here I was early in my career, 17 people coming to my house and telling me what to do. Well, I didn't know how to handle that. Mm-hmm. And I remember I shot and I felt it was awful. And I was upset with myself that I was embarrassed that I thought I'd done a very bad job. And it stayed with me to this day. I thought it was a lousy shoot. the magazine that I shot for put her on the cover, and they were happy. But I
was the
could see
magazine
things
for?
differently. It was a magazine out of Atlanta, I think, called Allure. I think it was a J'adore or Allure or something. But I thought I did a very bad job, and I never did that type of work again. Never. I decided that if you pay me the money, and I don't recommend the way I've lived to other people, but I got away with it, was that as I decided not to take the money and be hired because I'm an honest person and I felt I would do a dishonest job, and I'm not prepared to be dishonest. So I
respect
thought,
that.
you shouldn't hire me. I can only do what Richard does. I can't do what you want me to do. And by the way, my style as a photographer is I'm very all over the place and experimenting when I'm shooting. So when people do things like, for example, a catalog or in fashion, they want you to be very precise. You can't be somebody like me who's all over the place. So I realized that I shouldn't be hired. And so I chose never to be hired. What I did do was I chose girls that I thought were very hot and shot the content, and then when I could, sold the content. And so I did a certain amount of adults, which was great fun, and a lot of glamour that was fun. And there were magazines back in those days. Now we're living in a different time when there's no magazines and it's all Instagram, and there isn't really any value, in glamour work at all. So that's never worried me. I mean, I did a huge amount and had fun, and I moved on to other areas while I was doing it, and those areas are the ones that I've actually found are the backbone of, if you like, the pleasure I've got in the work that I've managed to achieve.
Out of all the shoots that you've done, okay, this is gonna be a weird question when I say it, but who do you think is not relatively the most prettiest person that you've shot, but the most unique and someone that you would look back onto saying that this person had an interesting look?
I don't think I could think about that because, first of all, I never played favorites in any of my shoots. I think anything that's on my walls or my books, I learned to like everything equally. People came in all shapes and sizes and attitudes, and everybody had something different to offer. And some were more maybe quirky than others, but I was able to turn that into an advantage. No, I think I don't really single anybody out at all that I can think of.
What about the
I
opposite?
avoided shooting celebrity because, again, I felt it was a pressure on me that I didn't want to have. And also, I didn't think it was something I was much good at. I knew what I stayed within the range of what I thought I was good at. I could do a certain, I sort of did a certain type of Playboy type girl. A lot of the girls I used were sort of dancers, hip music video dancers, video vixens, if you like. People who were exhibitionists. My shoots were very dynamic. And they were, I've never been a fashion shooter, so I don't do any of that at all. I had a certain sexy glamour that was full of effects, like, I got to be quite good at using water effects and fog and sun and things like that. So I had a certain style, and to have a certain style is pretty cool because you get identified for that style. That's quite rare, and I did have that style. A part of it was to do with ethnic diversity, which is that I simply worked with far more black models than I think anybody else did. I preferred
like that.
shooting black girls for glamour to white. Now, the reason for that was not necessarily the reason you might think. It's that my style of photography is very colorful, and I'm a color coordinator, and I felt the black skin looked better against
with
the
the
type
colors
of
that you're
colors
using.
that I liked. So, for example, golds and very rich colors like red velvet and things like that. I felt black
Black
skin
goes good with everything.
enhanced that, and if you put other skin, white skin or Asian skin, it simply didn't look as nice.
Yeah, I understand.
I also liked black models because many of them were very athletic and exuded this sort of strength that I like in my pictures. I'm proud of some of the series I've done of what I call warrior women. There are people who've said that what I was doing with black women to make them into warriors was, 15 years before Black Panther, and I'm proud of that.
That's good. Yeah, I like that. All right, so let's go into another one. Okay, so you were currently the owner of a $10 million mega mansion that has the most levels in all of California, and you even decided to add a nightclub into your home. Why did you do that?
Everybody thinks I have a nightclub in my home. I actually don't. What I have is what and the outside world looks at my house and judges me by thinking that it's a nightclub. It's my studio
It's your
that happens
studio.
to be colorful. If you think about most people, they're dead boring. Their studios are white or gray walls and white, gray tiles or
Let
something
me
like
let me
this.
remind you that there's also a bed inside of the studio.
Well, everywhere I have in the house, I put props.
Okay.
So any room in the house, anywhere I have, I'll take advantage of having anything there that you can draw on if you're going to use it. So I've shot girls with on beds. I've shot girls on poles. I've shot girls anything that I can have that you can use. You bet. And yes, down in my studio, if I want to go down and sleep down there, absolutely. I've got bedrooms all over the place because I've created atmospheres that are fun. So for me, what I find as a photographer, I think photography is about your mind and not about your eye. Okay, it sort of annoys me when people say you got a wonderful eye, because I say to them, well, why don't you say I got a wonderful left knee? It's, in other words, it's absurd. An eye is just light coming through, like a window.
Yeah.
It makes no judgment of any kind at all. It's all in your brain, how you see the world. So all of my photographs are a reflection of how I see the world and my values, my cultural literacy, my taste, whatever, or lack of taste. Now, when I did, for example, my club, what you think is my club is my studio, but I had done this vast range of work in the cosmic field, so I decided to make it look like a planetarium. So everybody who looks at it now think, oh, it's the most gaudy nightclub, whereas in fact it's just for me to enjoy an atmosphere where I can go and think away from LA and put myself in another world. Now, by doing that, it's been very powerful for me because I find that what's really benefited my work is giving myself the time to think about planning about what I want to do and getting into these other zones instead of just saying, oh, I got another hot girl and, being more predictable. I try to be unpredictable by doing clever things. I'm not, also my photography, I'm not vastly, I've shot 1 million pictures probably, but I'm not actually vastly interested in photography. I'm interested in being more like a David Blaine or a David Copperfield. We're doing complex things that people say, well, that's impossible.
Exactly.
But they are possible.
Doing
It's
stuff that
I
people don't think
challenge
is
people to
real.
show to push the medium further and further to show what is possible. And also I think I apply a bit of my scientific mind to it to do very complex things out of a sort of insatiable curiosity combined with a great deal of patience
Yeah.
in order to explore possibilities.
Next one. Okay. So what would you say are probably the hardest lessons that you had to learn to become the person that you are?
Wow.
I'm gonna be honest. That's a good because this is a question that I honestly want to have for myself because I feel like, especially growing up, and when you are destined for a lot, you have to go through a lot of trials and tribulations.
Yeah. Well, don't expect people to understand you, and you have to learn to stand for yourself and be sometimes completely alone, fighting for something. My parents never said a kind word at all about what I did as a photographer. Now, my parents were nice people. How is it possible? Because I think that, like billions of parents around the world, your parents want you to be safe. They want you to do something that's familiar. They don't want you to go so far away that you hurt yourself. And so my parents, my father, who was a businessman, who was a genius, who bought other companies all his life, he didn't appreciate somebody who was creating things from nothing. He couldn't understand the value in that, and particularly just pictures. I happen to think that pictures at the end of the day are very valuable because I've created a very serious body of art. But even if it wasn't valuable, I still would have just done it because it was a calling that I had to do. So you have to appreciate that people will not appreciate you, even if you create beautiful things, because they're very invested in being right about how they see the world. I think that's one lesson. Another lesson is that, if you choose to do what I did, which is to, be very generous and look after people unconditionally, that can be a very painful process, but it's still what I wanted to do. But you really, can sometimes suffer for it. And a lot of people think that, why should you suffer for other people and look after them? But I believe you get the world you deserve. So I took a number of people into my life who perhaps came from less fortunate backgrounds and tried to help them and take them into my family, if you will, make my own sort of family out of helping some other people. And that's been a very painful process because very often it doesn't work in the way that you would hope it would work. All my cosmic work stems from my having lost my foster child. I had looked after a girl since she was 18 who was mentally ill, and then she had a child, and that child, I was there the day she was born. It was a black child, she was a black girl, and I was there the day the child was born, and I absolutely loved him like my own child. And then I lost him. I was given him by DCFS, and then they took him away because I criticized the caseworker who was always late. And that nearly killed me. And I was so distraught that for a year I couldn't physically see anybody. I thought he was like basically dead. And out of that work came all my cosmic work because I wasn't seeing anybody. So I began to play with objects and I began to shoot abstracts, which is something that I'd never done in my life. And then out of my misery, I began to sort of create things that began to surprise me, that they looked like outer space things. And now that...
No, let's take a break. Let's just go. I'm loving.
All right, let's just jump straight to it.
Sure.
So you think Christianity is killing the black community? And
I don't say that. I think that Christianity has not been good for the black community. I think that blacks were enslaved by every European country that had ships. And every one of those European countries was, in fact, unbelievably religious, whether it be Protestant or Catholic. So, for example, the Spanish and the Portuguese were extremely religious Catholics. England was fiercely Catholic and then actually became Protestant. It was a bit of a mixture because of Henry VIII. I think the Dutch were I think they were Protestant. But each of these ship nations went to Africa and justified slavery. They had to find a justification to get cheap labor to get the resources from what they saw as the New World. So
yeah, and they used religion as their means.
Was the New World for some people was America. The New World for some people, the Catholic and Portuguese particularly, was South America. And they had to justify how you get cheap slavery. So they found a theological justification, which was that in the Old Testament, there is a thing called the curse of Ham. It's also known as the curse of Canaan, in which Noah cursed his 3 children, and the eldest of his children was called Ham. Well, if you look at the derivation of the word Ham in Arabic, it means dark. Mm-hmm. So I think that theologically what Christians did is they said that, oh, what does it matter about black people? They're cursed by God. It says so in the Bible. So they found a theological justification, which you can't make it up as more wicked if you tried, okay? You couldn't be more wicked. Now, that's on the Western world. In the Arab world, they found their own justification too. I don't know whether the justifications came from the Quran or not, but clearly they were slavers too. Mm-hmm. But you have to remember also that there was justifications within Africa. Africans sold slaves to each other were in the slavery business on a massive scale. I think nobody's innocent on this one. But if I was to talk just about America and the Europeans in the slave trade, which is if you are going to follow a religion that talks about love and how you should be wonderful and love, and do this to people, what is a religion worth? Absolutely nothing.
Mm-hmm. So, actually, one of the topics...
Because a religion should be judged not on what it says, but on its track record. Now, I don't feel very uncomfortable saying what I've just said because the church is busy apologizing for its history in slavery everywhere.
Yeah, because it's done so much.
But they don't deny it. But and a great deal more. So I think is it harmful? It's something that the black community is tremendously invested in tradition, and I can understand that. However, I think we have to get out of our traditions because sometimes they're not good for us. I happen to think that Christianity is not good for the black community. I think that they think it is, but I don't think it is.
No, I agree with you. I feel like, because especially you being a Jew, we spoke about this briefly in our talk about the differences on how the Jews were able to overcome their struggles while still the blacks are still complaining about stuff that happened over 200, 300 years ago.
But I think part of that, it's a very interesting question, and I think that you got in that black community, you've got the rise of a lot of very, very capable black conservatives who I think are the people worth listening to. And I'll give you some of the names: Coleman Hughes, Thomas Sowell, Glenn Lowry, Shelby Steele, John McWhorter, to a lesser extent. I mean, I also like Larry Elder, and there's a number of other people, but those are the voices that I find more interesting than the repetitive "I am a victim" voices.
Exactly.
But I think that the real problem is this: is that black people have faith, but I don't think faith is a good thing. What I like about
That's a
Judaism,
good, interesting
even though
point.
I'm an atheist, is that I like the emphasis in Judaism is not on faith but on behavior. We have no concept of, the test in Christianity is right faith. I am the light, I am the way, except through me thou cannot enter the kingdom of God. That is the fundamental. You cannot be a Christian without accepting Jesus as your savior. We have no equivalence in Judaism. We don't have, we only say the test of being Jewish is that you behave.
Exactly. So you're basically, if I can understand this, you're saying that people need to put their power of their life into their own hands instead of putting it onto someone else.
I believe that people can be absolutely wonderful. That's correct. Judaism doesn't believe, unlike Christianity, that you need somebody to save you. This is
Exactly,
man can save himself. That we can be magnificent. We have in Judaism a remarkably good code, I think, of ethical laws, because that was the focus of the religion, was on ethics rather than on faith. The focus on Christianity is on faith. So I don't think the emphasis on ethics means that people spend time on that aspect. Mm-hmm. And then to me, if you don't spend time on that aspect, then perhaps you get a disastrous world. I think we live in a country where the values of the country are, in fact, have been for many, many years in tremendous decline.
Oh, yeah, that's
and I think that we have a values problem. I happen to think the biggest problem in America is values, not anything else. You could say, I think everything else that we can talk about stems actually from values.
Yeah.
Whether it's economy or racism or theft or whatever it is, to me, good people don't do bad things.
Exactly.
The other thing, if I might, that I think I observe as somebody who's lived here for 40 years but refused to be a citizen, because I'm here for the weather. I don't buy into the values of the country. The fact is that I think this country's sick in a strange way. I think that it's never reconciled itself with its rotten past. It's a relatively recent country. I come from England, which is a much older country, civilization. So America's what, 300 years old, 350 years old?
Yeah.
Now, it was founded incredibly badly. Okay, we all know that. But here's the problem. You can't disavow your history. You can't bury your history as if it didn't exist. But we make the mistake in America of revering monsters. Washington had 250 slaves. Hitler didn't. And yet he's on our banknotes. He's the great man. But wait a minute, what if he wasn't a great man? Maybe he was a super general. He was a brave man. But he was the second largest slave owner in the country.
Exactly.
Why do we have to have him on our banknotes? I think that that's sick. Why do we have to have Jefferson on our banknotes? He was a rotten slave owner, too. He could have, this brilliant man could have said, this is awful, but he didn't. And you have to, why are these people on our notes? Now, I found myself in a very odd position. Because I sound political, but I'm not as political as I sound, but I just have positions. I found myself more extreme than BLM a few years back, because I want to knock down all statues, whether they're Confederate or non-Confederate. I think that statues themselves are divisive, because one man's opinion of somebody's heroism is somebody's feeling that this person is a villain who hurt people. If you want to have statues and be a sculptor, great. Make a statue, but stick it in a place, a museum or a housing for sculptures. Don't stick them right in the middle of people's face. So, for example, there was a very big movement, which I'm in favor of, to knock down Confederate statues, because I think that the South was essentially, that the Civil War was based on the South just wanting to perpetuate slavery. There's nothing about that that's noble. So I wouldn't put their soldiers in the public square. But I also don't want to see Washington or Jefferson. In fact, I don't want to see anybody else. I think they're all divisive.
So you would say get rid of
I
all
think
of them.
if people want to be artists, I'm an artist myself. If you want to be a sculptor and make figures, whatever they are, of people or of objects, I don't care. But don't stick divisive sculptures of people in the public square, if you like, so that we're supposed to venerate them, because one man's heroes is to somebody else's villains. So it just divides us. And it almost feels antiquated to me that we have statues at all. I can understand that we go to Greece and Rome and we see statues, but it doesn't seem to be a modern form. It seems to be an art form to me that you can continue to make them, but don't stick them in the middle of the forum. Don't stick them in the middle of in our faces.
No, well,
Robert E. Lee, to a lot of people, is simply a trader who wanted to perpetuate slavery. To a lot of people in the South, he's a hero. I understand that. I'm not stupid. But at the same time, I would be probably persuaded now that all statues should go.
in England or in Europe, you guys don't have like statues that you guys have, or more of like those are art figures.
Well, we're having this. England, they're facing the same problem. That, for example, I happen to revere Churchill. Okay, I'm well aware of Churchill's defects. I want you to know that, deeply aware. But at the same time, I wouldn't have been born if it wasn't for Churchill. Churchill is the savior of England in 1940. Had Churchill not become prime minister, the Nazis would have won, in my opinion. The only thing I think that why he's so famous is that he kept the country together against all the odds, and we would have been beaten. I would not have been born. My parents would have been sent to concentration camps. I wouldn't be here, like every other European country that was taken over by the Germans. So I have a huge respect for Churchill. I'm not unaware, however, of his defects as a person. But what's going on right now is you have this wholesale hatred of, as England's becoming so woke now and feeling this as the more immigration we have in the country from countries that used to be colonists of England, you've got now a lot of people feel, why, I hate Churchill because he did this to me in my country. Mm-hmm. So I'm a guy who probably believes let's get rid of all statues and we'd all be better off. Yeah. We don't have to have them.
Do you feel like it's this woke movement that's really hurting America and hurting today's society?
Well, in the case of getting rid of statues in America, I don't feel I'm woke. I would have done that for a long time.
Well, no, I'm saying the whole woke movement in regards of like how...
let's put it this way. There are some aspects that I could make that argument. If we seem to be spending a huge amount of time discussing transgender bathrooms, whilst Russia, Iran, North Korea, and China are hell-bent on having an axis of evil between them and other countries too, in order to destroy us.
Yeah, no, exactly.
So I would rather our focus was on something else that was serious. I live with somebody who's transgender. I've got total sympathy, but the amount of attention spent on something that is not the real issue about the great perils that we're facing in the world, which are incredibly real, fascinates me. I think we're a very frivolous nation. I think part of what's happening in America is that it's a self-inflicted wound. We're a nation that just wants to be entertained. We want more. We watch an excessive amount of football and basketball and sports, and listen to an excessive amount of music, watch an excessive amount of television. And what happens as a result of that is that, first of all, we just become less informed about the world in general. We make other people rich and make ourselves a bit poorer by not concentrating on developing ourselves. And so I think the country is sort of what I call out of balance. And if you were in China, they have this principle of yin and yang, of balance. We don't seem to have that balance, mm-hmm. where we're just excessive about everything. And to me, as a European, the dangers that the world is currently facing are so great, and yet people are so uninformed or disinterested. Now, I think that that's a terrible, terrible thing. We have real enemies who really mean harm. And so there are a number of serious people who think that it's not impossible for us to have civil war. There are a number of people who think that we're going to have an utter economic collapse. I mean, this is a country that's borrowed $30 trillion. We are a country who thinks it's marvelous to just get somebody else in China or Vietnam to build something for us instead of ourselves. And there's a price to be paid by all this outsourcing. We become, you make a few people extremely rich, and the rest of the country becomes poorer because they can't get the jobs. I don't like Trump, but at the same time, make America great again by bringing manufacturing back again. I'm in favor of that, but I wouldn't care which prime president it was. That's what we have to do. We've made ourselves dependent on a country that's now declared itself to be our enemy, which is China.
So what do you think, what changes would you suggest? Pretend you were going to be president. What were the first changes that you would make?
Well, the first thing I'd do is, everything for me is about building up our armaments. So I'm a great believer in defense. I think any country that lowers its defenses is always in danger. So I think a tremendous emphasis on defense is the first thing. The second thing is the citizenry. I think that you've got to put the teaching of values back into the American school system as the number one thing in the curriculum.
Get the